All right, everybody, we're going to talk and start today on solving equations, quadratic equations. So you spent a lot of time last week graphing those quadratics, but today we're going to focus or shift our focus into solving those quadratic equations. Now, what the heck does it mean to solve? Well, let's talk right now about what we talked about when we said x-intercepts. So if you remember back when we graphed, we said that one of the special points or one of the special items on our quadratic graphs were those x-intercept points. And we also called them roots. We also called them solutions. We also called them zeros. And basically what we're doing when we go through all of these solving processes for the next week or so is finding with algebra those 2 points where that graph crosses the x-intercept. So we're going to go through and we're going to try to find all of those points where that graph is equal to 0. Okay, so if we go through, we're going to start with our first kind of solving, and that's going to be with square roots. This is going to be very easy for us. However, you need to know that you can only use square roots when you do not have a linear term. So you cannot have an x term. You have an x squared term, you have a number term, but you cannot have a middle x term. So that will be only for things that say x squared equals a number x squared equals another number, a number x squared plus a number equals 0, or a number x squared plus another number equals 0. Notice that middle term in all of those, that x term is missing. So how do we go through and do this? Well, that's really easy. First, we're going to go through and do all of our inverse operations to get x squared alone. So just like we would solve a regular equation for x, we're going to go through and solve our equation basically for x squared. Then, once we have x squared alone, we're going to use our square root to undo that squared function. So square root and squared are inverse functions. So to undo the squared, we're going to use square root. The thing you have to remember here is that if you're taking the square root, then you need to have a plus and a minus answer. So a positive answer and a negative answer. Okay? So let's take a look at an example. If I have 3x squared minus 75 equals 0, that's my original problem. And what I'm trying to do here is find where does that graph with algebra cross the x-axis. So basically, what are its x-intercepts if I was using algebra? So I'm going to go through and try to get x squared by itself. And the first thing to do is add 75 to get that x squared by itself. So then I have 3x squared equals 75. I'm going to divide by 3. That gives me x squared equals 25. Take the square root of both sides. And of course, the square root of 25 is 5, but it's also negative 5. So my 2 points where this graph crosses the x-axis are at 5 and negative 5. So if you think about a graph, and you can kind of picture that in your head, you're going to have a U shape that's going to cross at both 5 and negative 5. Okay. So square roots are pretty easy. You're just going to get that x squared term by itself, take the square root, and you have a positive and a negative answer. Sometimes you might need your calculator to do that square root, so be careful there. Okay? There's a whole bunch of practice at the bottom. I'll show you that in a minute. The other way we're going to solve today is using factoring, which we already know how to do because we spent all last chapter on factoring. So the new thing here is that when we factor, we're going to have to use this thing called the zero product property. And basically, the zero product property says that if you have any number times another number equal to 0, then either the first number can be 0 or the second number can be 0, and the whole equation will be equal to 0. So you can see in this yellow box that if we have x plus 3 and x plus 2, those are both numbers, remember, even though they're written as factors. So if either of those parentheses is equal to 0, then our whole thing will be equal to 0 because 0 times anything is 0. So when we go to solve, we're going to have our two factors and we're going to set each factor equal to 0. All right, so what are your steps for factoring? So number one, you're going to make sure your equation is equal to 0. That is very important. Then you're going to use your factoring skills that we talked about last chapter. Factor out the GCF, use regular factoring or slide and divide or guess and check, whichever one you're comfortable with. Maybe it's a special case or maybe you need to factor by grouping. So you're going to get those factors with those parentheses. That's step 2. And then finally, you're going to set each parentheses equal to 0 to use that zero product property. So here's our example. If we start out with m squared plus 9m plus 14 equals 0, I'm going to first factor the m squared plus 9n plus 14. So I'm going to think to myself, okay, what are two numbers that multiply to 14 and add to 9? That's going to be 7 and 2. So that left side becomes m plus 7 and m plus 2 equals 0. That tells me that if either the first parentheses or the second parentheses equals 0, the whole thing will be equal to 0. So I want to go through and find each parentheses equal to 0. So first I set m plus 7 equal to 0, solve that, and I get negative 7. Then I set the second parentheses equal to 0 and solve that and get negative 2. That tells me that at two places, negative 2 and negative 7, that graph crosses the x-axis and its solutions are negative 2, negative 7. All right, so if you take a look below the notes, you'll see the square root practice, and then below that is the factoring practice. The square root practice is just a couple of problems, and then the answers are below that. The factoring practice is a maze, so there's directions on there on how to do the maze if you forget. And remember, all of that is just practice for you. If you have any questions, remember we are meeting on our class team on Tuesday from 10 to 12, so feel free to pop in there with your questions.